The news reached Earth before Admiral Carter's transport did. Someone had leaked the verdict to the media networks, and within hours, every screen on the planet was showing the same footage. The Great Hall of Kairos Prime, the alien rulers on their thrones, the sentence of banishment being read aloud. Panic spread through the cities like wildfire. People filled the streets, some screaming for war, others weeping at the thought of being cut off from the stars. Markets crashed. Governments called emergency sessions. Religious leaders spoke of the end times, while scientists tried to explain what a 10,000-year barrier would mean. President Laura Mitchell watched the chaos from her office in Geneva. She was 53 years old, a former aerospace engineer who had risen through politics on a platform of space development and scientific progress. She had never imagined leading humanity through something like this. Her advisors urged her to make a statement. Tell the people to stay calm. Promise that Earth would survive the isolation. Give them hope, even if that hope was hollow. But Laura had received a private message from Admiral Carter during his journey home. A message that changed everything. A message about a plan called Exodus. She gathered the leaders of every nation for a closed session at the United Nations. Security was tighter than it had ever been. No recording devices were permitted. No one was allowed to leave until the meeting was over. Then she told them the truth. Humanity was not going to accept banishment. They were not going to sit behind a barrier and count the centuries until it fell. They were going to take everything that mattered, every person who wanted to go, and they were going to leave the galaxy entirely. The room exploded into chaos. Some leaders called it impossible. Others called it madness. A few simply sat in stunned silence, unable to process what they were hearing. Director Kevin Park of the Global Science Initiative stepped forward to explain the technical details. He was a quiet man with glasses and a gentle voice, the kind of person who spent his life in laboratories rather than boardrooms. But when he spoke about Exodus, his eyes burned with a fire that silenced the doubters. For 15 years, his team had been secretly developing technology for exactly this scenario. Not banishment specifically, but catastrophe. The death of the sun. An asteroid too large to stop. A war that made Earth uninhabitable. They had planned for every disaster, and they had prepared a solution. The jump drive. It was humanity's greatest secret, a technology so far beyond anything the 12 empires possessed that they would not have believed it possible. A single ship equipped with a jump drive could cross distances that would take conventional vessels thousands of years. A fleet of ships could carry humanity to the edge of the universe itself. They had hidden this technology for one simple reason. If the 12 empires knew about it, they would have demanded it for themselves. They would have taken it by force if necessary. Some secrets were too dangerous to share. Now that secret would save them. The construction effort began within days. Shipyards that had been building commercial transports were converted to produce colony vessels. Factories that made consumer goods switched to manufacturing cryopods and life support systems. Mining operations on the Moon and Mars doubled their output, then tripled it. Engineer Nathan Cole led the ship construction teams. He was a big man with rough hands and a booming laugh, the kind of person who could solve any problem with enough time and coffee. Now he was facing the biggest problem in human history, and he attacked it with everything he had. His teams worked in shifts around the clock. No one complained about the long hours. No one asked for days off. Everyone understood what was at stake. For the first time in history, humanity was truly united by a single purpose. Meanwhile, Dr. Ashley Morgan led the Biological Preservation Program. Her job was to save not just humans, but everything that made Earth special. Every plant, every animal, every microorganism that might be important someday. She gathered seeds and embryos and genetic samples, storing them in vaults that would travel with the fleet. She told her team that they were building an ark, not just for survival, but for memory. Everything beautiful about Earth deserved to see new stars. The song of a whale, the color of a sunset, the taste of rain on summer leaves. These things could not be measured or calculated, but they were what made life worth living. The months passed quickly. Ships took shape in orbits around Earth and Mars and the outer planets. Colony vessels that could carry 100,000 people each. Agricultural ships filled with soil and seeds. Industrial platforms that would build new cities on new worlds. Hospital ships, school ships, ships carrying museums and libraries and everything humanity had created over its long history. The 12 empires watched from afar. Their surveillance drones tracked the construction effort, sending reports back to Kairos Prime. The alien rulers studied the data and reached a conclusion that made perfect sense to them. The humans were preparing for isolation, building supplies that would last through the long darkness, gathering their people in one place for the final goodbye to the stars. They did not understand what they were seeing. No species in recorded history had ever tried to leave the galaxy. No species had ever refused to accept the judgment of the assembly. The idea that humanity might simply reject their authority and walk away was beyond their imagination. This was their greatest weakness. They had ruled for so long that they had forgotten what desperation looked like. They had forgotten that trapped animals will do anything to survive. They had forgotten that humanity had been fighting against impossible odds since the first human ancestor picked up a rock and decided to fight back against a predator. On the last day of the 5th month, President Laura Mitchell addressed the planet. She stood on a platform in front of the United Nations building, surrounded by the flags of every nation, and she spoke to 12 billion people at once. She told them the truth, not the comfortable lies that some advisors had suggested, not the false hope of waiting out the barrier. The truth. They were leaving. All of them. Everyone who wanted to go was guaranteed a place on the ships. No one would be left behind because of money or status or the circumstances of their birth. This was humanity's journey, and every human was invited. The destination was a place no one had ever seen. A young galaxy on the far edge of the universe, filled with worlds waiting to be claimed. The journey would take centuries, and many who left would never see the end, but their children would. Their grandchildren would walk on new Earth, under new suns, and know that their ancestors had given them everything. She asked them to be brave. She asked them to trust each other. She asked them to remember that humanity had faced extinction before, and had always found a way to survive. Then she looked directly into the camera and smiled. She told them that she would be on one of the first ships. Her place was with her people, wherever they went. The final month of preparation began. Across the planet, families packed their belongings and said goodbye to homes that had sheltered generations. Schools held final classes. Couples got married in hastily arranged ceremonies. Children were born who would never know Earth except as a story. And above them, the fleet grew larger every day. Thousands of ships, then tens of thousands, then more than anyone could count. Humanity was getting ready to leave. The morning of the last day dawned clear and beautiful over most of Earth. The sun rose over oceans that had birthed life billions of years ago, casting golden light across cities that would soon stand empty. Birds sang in parks where children had played yesterday and would never play again. The world went on as it always had, not knowing or caring that its masters were leaving. Captain Ryan Donnelly stood on the bridge of the New Horizon, the flagship of the human fleet. He was 41 years old, with a weathered face and steady hands, that had guided ships through asteroid fields and solar storms. Nothing in his experience had prepared him for this moment. Through the viewport, he could see Earth floating in the darkness. The planet was surrounded by ships, millions of them. Vessels of every size and shape hung in the atmosphere and orbited above, their engines glowing like stars born close to home. The largest fleet ever assembled by any species in the history of the galaxy. Admiral Daniel Carter's voice came through the communication system, calm and clear despite the weight of what was happening. He was coordinating the departure from a command station near the moon, watching the feeds from 10,000 different sources, making sure everything went according to plan. The final transports were lifting off from the surface now. In cities across the planet, the last residents were boarding shuttles that would carry them to the waiting colony ships. Some went willingly, eager to begin the great adventure. Others had to be gently encouraged by friends and family who refused to leave them behind. A few chose to stay, preferring death on the world they loved to life among unknown stars. Megan Torres stood beside Admiral Carter, monitoring the departure schedules on her tablet. The numbers were almost impossible to comprehend. 12 billion people from Earth, another 8 billion from the colonies on Mars, the Moon, and the outer moons. Billions of frozen embryos and genetic samples. The complete contents of every library, museum, and archive on the planet. Everything that humanity had created over 100,000 years of civilization was rising into the sky. On the surface, Dr. Christina Vance led the final team to leave. She was an archaeologist who had spent her life studying the past, digging through ancient ruins to understand where humanity had come from. Now she was performing one last act of preservation. In the heart of Africa, at a site near the place where humans had first evolved, she knelt in the red dirt and buried a small capsule. It was made of the strongest materials human science could create, designed to last for millions of years. Inside was a message for anyone who might find it someday. The message was simple. We were here. We built cities and dreamed dreams. We loved and lost and learned. We left, but we did not forget. One day, we will return. Christina stood and looked around at the ancient landscape. Somewhere nearby, millions of years ago, the first humans had taken their first steps. They had looked up at the stars and wondered what was out there. They had never imagined that their descendants would one day walk among those stars. And they certainly had never imagined those descendants would leave. Her shuttle lifted off as the sun began to set. Through the window, she watched the Earth grow smaller, the continents becoming visible as brown and green patches against the blue oceans. She cried without shame. Everyone on the shuttle was crying. This was not a moment for pretending to be strong. The fleet assembled at the edge of the solar system, far beyond the orbit of the most distant planet. 8,000 major vessels carrying the bulk of humanity. Tens of thousands of smaller ships handling supplies and support. The largest gathering of human beings in one place since the species had evolved. Admiral Carter addressed them all. His voice carried to every ship through communication systems that had been built specifically for this moment. He told them that this was not an escape. This was not a defeat. This was a choice. The universe had told humanity where it could not go. The rulers of the galaxy had decided that humans were not worthy of the stars. They had been wrong about humans before. They were wrong now. Humanity was not going to sit behind a wall and wait for permission to exist. They were going to find their own place among the stars. They were going to build something new, something that belonged to them and no one else. And someday, when they were ready, they would return to show the galaxy what they had become. The jump drives powered up across the fleet. Energy levels that would have seemed impossible to alien observers surged through systems that humanity had spent decades perfecting in secret. Every ship locked onto the same coordinates, a point in space so distant that light itself would take millions of years to reach it. In the council chamber on Kairos Prime, alarm signals began to flash. The alien rulers gathered before their sensors, watching as impossible readings flooded their displays. The human fleet was doing something that should not be possible. Energy signatures beyond anything recorded in 40,000 years of galactic history. High Chancellor Vorath demanded an explanation. His scientists had none to give. The humans were using technology they should not possess, doing things that violated the accepted laws of physics. This was not the behavior of a defeated species preparing for isolation. Then the fleet vanished. 8,000 ships and 12 billion souls disappeared in a cascade of light that burned bright enough to be seen across half the galaxy. One moment they were there. The next moment they were gone, jumped further in a single instant than any vessel had ever traveled before. The sensors searched for them. The tracking systems calculated trajectories. The alien scientists ran simulation after simulation, trying to figure out where the humans had gone. They found nothing. The human fleet had traveled to a region of space so distant that no probe had ever reached it, no sensor had ever mapped it, no empire had ever claimed it. They were beyond the edge of the known universe, in the darkness between galaxies, where the stars grew thin and hope was supposed to die. The barrier activated as scheduled, a shell of pure energy surrounding an empty solar system. Earth still orbited its sun, still turned through its days and nights, still supported the birds and animals that humans had left behind. But its cities were dark, its roads were empty, its people were gone. High Chancellor Vorath stared at the readings for a long time. The barrier hummed with power, sealing away a planet that no longer mattered. 10,000 years of isolation imposed on a species that had already left. For the first time in his long life, the High Chancellor felt something like fear. He had ruled the galaxy for centuries. He had seen species rise and fall, civilizations bloom and wither. He had thought he understood the natural order of things. He had been wrong. The humans had not accepted their punishment. They had not begged for mercy or fought in futile desperation. They had simply refused to play by the rules that everyone else accepted without question. And now they were out there, somewhere beyond the reach of his power, building something that he could not see or control or understand. The High Chancellor looked at the empty solar system on his display and wondered for the first time if banishment had been the right decision. But it was too late to change anything now. The humans were gone. 300 years of darkness passed like a dream between the stars. The human fleet emerged from its long journey into a region of space that had never known intelligent life. A young galaxy spinning slowly in the void, filled with billions of stars that had never been named, and millions of worlds that had never felt the touch of living feet. It was beautiful beyond description, a canvas of light and darkness, waiting to be painted with the colors of civilization. Captain Eric Carter stood on the bridge of the New Horizon, the same ship his ancestor had commanded when the Exodus began. He was the 7th generation of his family to serve aboard the vessel, and he had been trained since childhood for this moment, the moment when humanity would finally see its new home. The sensors swept across the galaxy, cataloging everything they found. Habitable worlds by the thousands. Resources beyond anything humanity had ever possessed. Room to grow without limit, to expand without asking permission, to build without fear of ancient rulers telling them where they could and could not go. Eric ordered the fleet to halt while the survey teams did their work. Around him, 8,000 ships held position, their crews waking from cryosleep to learn that the long journey was finally over. Children who had been born on the ships during the voyage pressed against viewports to see real stars for the first time, not the blurred lines of light that appeared during jump travel. President Derek Santos addressed the fleet from the new capital ship, Unity. He was a tall man with a kind face and a gift for finding the right words at the right time. His family had served in government since before the Exodus, passing down the responsibility of leadership through 7 generations of sacrifice and service. He told them what they already knew. Against all odds, across distances that should have killed them, they had survived. Their ancestors had made a promise when they left Earth, a promise that humanity would not fade away into nothing. That promise had been kept. Now it was time to fulfill the next part of the plan. It was time to build. The colonization began immediately. Engineer Samantha Gray led the first teams to the surface of a world they named New Terra. It was smaller than Earth, with lighter gravity and a thicker atmosphere, but it had clean water and fertile soil and everything they needed to start again. The first structures went up within hours of landing, temporary shelters that would soon give way to permanent buildings. Other teams spread out across the galaxy, claiming worlds with the same desperate energy that had driven the Exodus itself. Desert planets and jungle planets and frozen worlds where the ice went down for miles. Every environment that could support human life was settled, adapted, transformed into a home. The cryoships released their passengers in waves over the following decades. Billions of people who had slept through the journey woke to find themselves in a universe that was entirely their own. Some struggled with the change, some never fully adjusted, but most threw themselves into the work of building, understanding that they had been given something precious beyond measure, a second chance. Dr. Patrick Walsh led the Historical Preservation Society, an organization created to ensure that humanity never forgot where it came from. Every child in the new civilization learned about Earth. They studied its history, its cultures, its mistakes and triumphs. They learned the names of the continents and oceans. They learned about the animals that had shared the planet with their ancestors. In every city, on every colony world, monuments rose to commemorate the home they had left behind. Parks were filled with trees, grown from seeds that had traveled across the universe. Museums displayed artifacts from Earth, tools and artworks and everyday objects that connected the present to the past. The passage of time changed many things, but it did not change the fundamental nature of humanity. People fell in love and started families. Artists created beauty. Scientists pushed the boundaries of knowledge. Politicians argued about policies, while ordinary citizens went about their lives, working and dreaming and hoping for better tomorrows. But they also prepared. Admiral Victoria Lane commanded the first expeditionary fleet, the most advanced military force humanity had ever created. She was a small woman with fierce eyes and a mind that processed tactical information faster than most computers. Her entire career had been devoted to one purpose: ensuring that humanity would never be vulnerable again. Under her command, new technologies were developed that would have seemed impossible to the species that had banished them. Ships that could cross galaxies in days instead of centuries. Weapons that drew power directly from stars. Shields that could withstand impacts that would shatter planets. Sensors that could detect a single vessel across distances that light took years to travel. This was not done out of aggression. Humanity had learned its lesson about the dangers of uncontrolled expansion. They had no desire to conquer the galaxy they had left behind, or to destroy the species that had cast them out. But they would never again accept judgment from those who did not understand them. They would never again be told where they could live or how they could grow. The next time anyone tried to banish humanity, they would find themselves facing a civilization that had spent millennia preparing for exactly that moment. 3,000 years passed, then 5,000, then 8. The countdown continued in the deepest archives of the government, tracked by automated systems that never forgot and never stopped. 10,000 years since banishment. 10,000 years of growth and change and progress. 10,000 years of building something new while never forgetting what had been lost. The barrier around Sol was scheduled to fall soon. The isolation that had been imposed on an empty system would finally end, opening the path back to Earth. The question that had lingered in human consciousness for 100 centuries was about to be answered. Would they go back? President Adam Young called a meeting of the Grand Council to discuss the matter. Representatives from 1,000 colony worlds gathered in the Great Hall of New Terra, their holographic images filling a space that would have dwarfed the ancient council chamber on Kairos Prime. The debate lasted for weeks. Some argued that Earth was no longer relevant, that humanity had outgrown its birthplace and had no need to return. Others insisted that the homeworld belonged to them by right, that abandoning it forever would mean abandoning something essential about who they were. In the end, the decision was clear. Earth had given humanity life. Earth had sheltered them through their long childhood as a species. Earth was where their story had begun, and Earth was where at least some part of their future belonged. They would return, not as conquerors, not as refugees. They would return as equals, as a civilization that had proven itself worthy of the stars in ways that the 12 empires had never imagined possible. Ambassador Katie Chen was chosen to deliver the message. She was a direct descendant of one of the original colonists, a woman whose family had kept the memory of Earth alive through 10,000 years of exile. She accepted the honor with quiet dignity, understanding the weight of what she was being asked to do. A small ship was prepared for her journey, equipped with the most advanced technology humanity possessed. It would carry her across the gulf between galaxies, through the darkness that had once seemed so terrifying, back to the solar system that her ancestors had left behind. The night before she departed, Katie stood on a balcony, overlooking the capital city of New Terra. Billions of lights twinkled below her, each one representing a life that would have been impossible without the courage of those first colonists. Behind her, the young galaxy spun slowly through the eternal night, filled with human worlds and human dreams. Tomorrow, she would begin the journey home, and the universe would learn what humanity had become. The barrier fell on a morning that no one was alive to witness. It had surrounded the Sol system for exactly 10,000 years, a perfect prison of energy designed to keep humanity contained while they learned humility. Now its power source was exhausted, its purpose fulfilled, its time ended. Ambassador Katie Chen watched from her small vessel as the last traces of the barrier faded into nothing. Beyond it, she could see the sun that had warmed her ancestors for millions of years. The yellow light seemed impossibly familiar, even though she had never seen it before, except in images and simulations. Somewhere in that system, Earth still orbited. Empty and silent, yes, but still there, still waiting. Katie transmitted a message to the Galactic Assembly, the first official communication from humanity in 10 millennia. Her words were chosen carefully, reviewed by diplomats and historians and psychologists who understood the importance of this moment. She requested permission to address the Council of the 12 Empires. The response came quickly. High Chancellor Voreth XIV, descendant of the ruler who had cast the original banishment vote, granted her request with elaborate courtesy. He assumed, as his advisors assumed, that the humans had spent 10,000 years learning their place. They would return humble and broken, begging to be readmitted to galactic society on whatever terms were offered. Katie traveled to Kairos Prime, following the same route that Admiral Daniel Carter had taken so long ago. The Great Hall looked exactly as it had in the historical records, a monument to power that had not changed in 40,000 years. The same thrones rose into the shadows. The same alien rulers sat upon them, ancient and unchanging. She walked to the center of the chamber alone, a small human woman, surrounded by beings who had ruled the stars since before her species had learned to write. The aliens looked down at her with expressions that mixed curiosity with contempt. They expected submission. They expected apologies. They were disappointed. Behind Katie, outside the station, sensors began detecting the arrival of the human fleet. Ships appeared out of jump space, in numbers that grew with every passing second. Vessels larger than anything the 12 empires had ever built. Warships that bristled with weapons no alien scientist could identify. Colony ships, and transport ships, and support vessels beyond counting. The humans had not spent 10,000 years in isolation. They had spent 10,000 years building. High Chancellor Vorath stared at the readings, his 4 compound eyes unable to process what they were seeing. The human fleet was larger than the combined forces of all 12 empires. Their technology was so far advanced that it might as well have been magic. The species that had been banished for the crime of expanding too quickly had expanded beyond anything the galaxy had ever imagined. Katie waited patiently while the alien rulers whispered among themselves, their translators working overtime to convey shock and fear and disbelief. She had all the time in the universe. Humanity had learned patience during its long exile. When the chamber finally fell silent, she spoke. Her voice was calm and clear, carrying to every corner of the great hall without any need for amplification. She told them that she was not there to beg for readmission to galactic society. She was not there to negotiate terms or accept conditions. She was there to deliver a message. Humanity had found a new home among the stars. They had built a civilization that stretched across an entire galaxy, encompassing thousands of worlds and trillions of souls. They had developed technology that made the 12 empires look primitive by comparison. They had grown beyond anything their ancestors could have imagined. They did not need permission to exist. They did not need approval from rulers who had tried to destroy them. They did not need the galactic community, but they were choosing to return anyway. Katie paused to let her words sink in. The alien rulers shifted uncomfortably on their thrones, uncertain how to respond to a species that refused to follow the expected patterns of behavior. She continued, Earth belonged to humanity. It always had, and it always would. The human fleet would be traveling to the Sol system to reclaim the world that had given birth to their species. Any empire that objected to this was welcome to voice their concerns. She smiled as she said this, the same smile that Admiral Carter had worn 10,000 years ago. The smile of a species that had been underestimated for the last time. No one objected. High Chancellor Vorath found his voice at last. He asked, with careful diplomacy that did not quite hide his fear, what humanity wanted from the Galactic Assembly. Katie told him that humanity wanted nothing. They had learned long ago that the only things worth having were the things they built themselves. But they were prepared to offer a gift, freely given, with no strings attached. Knowledge. 10,000 years of scientific advancement. Medical technologies that could extend life indefinitely and cure diseases that had plagued organic species since the dawn of time. Agricultural methods that could end hunger on any world. Energy sources that made everything the 12 empires possessed look like primitive fire. The price was simple. The assembly would acknowledge that humanity was their equal, not their subject. Not a minor species to be judged and punished by those who considered themselves superior. Their equal. And they would never, under any circumstances, try to banish humanity again. The vote was unanimous. All 12 empires agreed to the terms without debate. They had no choice. The human fleet, hovering outside the station, made the consequences of refusal very clear, without a single threatening word being spoken. Katie accepted their agreement with gracious formality. She told them that humanity looked forward to a new relationship with the galactic community, one based on mutual respect rather than dominance and submission. There would be challenges ahead, certainly. Old wounds would take time to heal, but she believed that the galaxy would be better for having humanity as a partner rather than a prisoner. She turned to leave, then paused at the door. She looked back at the assembled rulers, at the great hall that had seemed so terrifying in the historical records, at the creatures who had once held the power of life and death over her entire species. She thanked them for the banishment. The rulers stared at her, confused. Why would she thank them for the worst punishment ever imposed on humanity? Katie explained. 10,000 years ago, the 12 empires had tried to punish humanity by sealing them away in darkness. They had intended to crush the human spirit, to break their will, to teach them that resistance was futile. Instead, they had given humanity the universe. The Exodus had forced humans to become stronger, smarter, more united than they had ever been before. The challenge of colonizing a new galaxy had pushed them to develop technologies that would have taken millions of years under normal circumstances. The memory of banishment had given them a purpose that never faded, a determination that never wavered. Everything humanity had become, they owed to the rulers who had tried to destroy them. Katie smiled one last time and walked out of the chamber. Behind her, the alien rulers sat in stunned silence, finally understanding the truth that had eluded them for 10 millennia. Humanity had never been a species that accepted defeat. They were a species that turned defeat into victory. Outside the station, the human fleet began its journey to Earth. Millions of people who had never seen their ancestral home would soon walk on the soil that had given birth to their species. They would restore the cities and clean the waters and fill the silent places with life once again. And in the years that followed, as human technology spread across the galaxy, and human influence grew beyond anything the 12 empires could challenge, the rulers would remember this day. They would remember the small woman who had stood before them without fear, representing a civilization that had refused to die. They would remember the lesson they had learned too late. Never underestimate humanity. Earth hung in the viewport of Katie's ship as she approached, blue and beautiful against the darkness of space. Tears filled her eyes as she looked at the world her ancestors had left behind, the world that had waited 10,000 years for its children to return. She whispered words that no one else could hear. She told Earth that they were home, and this time they were staying forever. The Great Hall of Kairos Prime was the largest structure ever built by any species in the known universe. It floated in the empty space between 3 dying stars, a monument of crystal and living metal that stretched for miles in every direction. Here, the rulers of the 12 empires gathered to decide the fate of civilizations. Here, species rose to power or fell into extinction based on the whims of beings who had ruled the stars for 40,000 years. Admiral Daniel Carter stood alone in the center of the chamber. He was a tall man with gray hair and tired eyes, wearing the dark blue uniform of Earth's United Fleet. Around him, 12 massive thrones rose into the shadows above, each one holding a creature so different from humanity that the human mind struggled to comprehend their forms. High Chancellor Vorith sat on the tallest throne. He was a creature of silver armor and 4 glowing eyes, his body a twisted combination of insect and machine that had evolved over millions of years. When he spoke, his voice echoed through the chamber, like thunder rolling across an empty plain. The charges against humanity were read aloud. Unauthorized expansion into restricted space. Settlement of 3 worlds outside the designated human zone. Cultural contamination of primitive species. Aggressive development of military technology. Refusal to submit to imperial inspection protocols. Daniel listened without moving. His face showed nothing. His hands remained steady at his sides. He had been a soldier for 30 years, and he had learned long ago that showing weakness to an enemy only invited attack. The other rulers spoke in turn. The Vrath, creatures of pure energy contained in crystalline shells, voted for punishment. The Morkai, massive beings of stone and fire who had conquered 1,000 worlds, demanded humanity be made an example. The Sindari, cold intelligences that existed as patterns in quantum foam, calculated that human removal would benefit galactic stability. One by one, all 12 empires voted against Earth. High Chancellor Vorith raised one clawed hand and pronounced the sentence. Humanity was to be banished from the galactic community. A barrier of pure energy would be erected around their home system, cutting them off from all contact with other species. No trade, no travel, no communication. The isolation would last for 10,000 years, long enough for humanity to learn humility, or to fade away into nothing. The Chancellor asked if the human representative understood the verdict. Daniel looked up at the towering figure above him. For a long moment, he said nothing. The alien rulers shifted in their thrones, uncertain what to make of this strange silence. They had expected begging. They had expected threats. They had expected some display of the famous human emotion that made their species so unpredictable. Instead, Daniel simply nodded. He said that he understood. Then he turned and walked toward the exit, without another word. Behind him, whispers filled the chamber. The rulers leaned toward each other, their translators working overtime to convey confusion and uncertainty. The human had accepted banishment without protest. This was not normal. This was not how conquered species behaved. High Chancellor Voreth watched the small figure disappear through the massive doors. Something cold moved through his ancient mind, a feeling he had not experienced in centuries. It took him a moment to recognize it. It was doubt. On the transport ship returning to Earth, Daniel sat in a small cabin with Lieutenant Megan Torres, his aide, and the only other human who had been permitted to attend the hearing. She was young, barely 30, with sharp eyes and a quick mind that had earned her a place at his side. She asked what they were going to do. Daniel looked out the viewport at the stars streaming past. The journey home would take 3 days at maximum speed. 3 days to process what had happened. 3 days to plan what came next. He told her that they had been given 6 months to prepare for isolation. 6 months before the barrier went up, and humanity was sealed away from the universe forever. The 12 empires expected them to spend that time in despair, gathering resources and saying goodbye to the stars they would never see again. Megan asked if they were going to fight. She knew the odds were impossible. The combined fleets of the 12 empires numbered in the millions. Their technology was thousands of years ahead of anything humanity possessed. A war would mean extinction. Daniel smiled, but there was no warmth in it. He said they were not going to fight. Fighting was what the empires expected. Fighting was what they were prepared for. Humanity had survived for 100,000 years by being unpredictable, by refusing to follow the rules that others set for them. They were going to do something the 12 empires had never seen before. They were going to leave. Megan stared at him, not understanding. Leave where? The barrier would surround the entire solar system. There was nowhere to go. Daniel explained the plan that had been forming in his mind since the moment the verdict was announced. Humanity had been exploring the edges of known space for decades. They had found regions so distant that even the 12 empires had never sent probes there. Dark spaces between galaxies where the stars grew thin and the void stretched forever. There were resources there, worlds there, room to grow without limit or restriction, room to build something new without asking permission from rulers who saw humanity as nothing more than troublesome children. The 12 empires wanted to lock humanity away for 10,000 years. Fine. Let them lock away an empty system. Let them spend their time watching dead cities and silent oceans, while humanity built a civilization beyond their reach. Megan asked how they could possibly move everyone. 12 billion people on Earth alone, billions more on the colonies. The logistics were impossible. The resources required were beyond calculation. Daniel told her that nothing was impossible. Humanity had crawled out of caves and learned to split atoms. They had cured diseases that once killed millions. They had reached the stars against odds that should have crushed them. Moving 12 billion people was just another problem to solve, and they had 6 months to solve it. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. There was so much to do. Governments to convince, industries to redirect, ships to build, people to organize. It would be the largest undertaking in human history, a project that would make every previous achievement look small by comparison. But humanity had always been at its best when survival was on the line. When the universe told them something was impossible, they found a way to prove it wrong. This would be no different. The transport ship flew on through the darkness between stars, carrying 2 humans back to a world that did not yet know its fate had been decided. In 6 months, the barrier would rise. In 6 months, humanity would be cut off from the galaxy forever. Or so the 12 empires believed. Daniel smiled again in the darkness of his cabin. They had made a mistake, these ancient rulers. They had given humanity a deadline. They had given humanity a reason to unite. They had given humanity something to prove. And that was all humanity had ever needed.